What remains of the Code of Ur-Nammu is the oldest known surviving law code. The code was discovered on 2 fragments found at the Sumerian city of Nippur and translated by Samuel Kramer in 1952. However, these fragments were so badly damaged, only the prologue and 5 laws were discernible. As luck would have it, further tablets were found in Ur and translated in 1965, allowing 40 of the 57 laws to be reconstructed, so at least we know that we have most of them. Another copy of the laws found in the northern Sumerian city of Sippar corroborated the laws themselves, although there were slight variations in the text, which I would presume to mean that they weren't all carved at the same place and at the same time by the same people and then sent out to the various cities where they would be enforced. It's important to note that the Code of Ur-Nammu is not the earliest code of laws that we know about, it's just the earliest code of laws that we have. We know that the Sumerian king of Lagash, called Uruk-agina, actually had his own code of laws that predates this code by probably about 300 years. Uruk-agina lived in the 24th century BC and was a contemporary of the Sumerian conqueror Lugal-Zaghazi, who conquered Lagash and burnt it to the ground. This was the man who lost his empire to Sargon of Akkad when the Akkadian Empire was formed. Uruk-agina's code of laws was very reformist and designed to weed out corruption and prevent the oppression of the poor and the destitute from the rich and powerful. However, we don't actually have it, we've only got references to it, one of which is in the form of a praise poem, where the author of the poem is praising Uruk-agina for his particularly enlightened laws. Returning to Ur-Nammu's laws then, he was the ruler who dominated Sumer after the fall of the Akkadian Empire. He was the king of Ur, part of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and his code of laws was written about 300 years before Hammurabi's code, and in a lot of ways it's actually very much more forward-looking and very much more, well, progressive. Whereas Hammurabi's code is famous for an eye for an eye. That's a principle that isn't found in Ur-Nammu's code, although it's very common in ancient Mesopotamian codes, well, ancient law codes in general, for certain crimes to simply be punishable by death. Other crimes that aren't quite as serious are not repaid with retribution, but instead with recompense in the form of silver. So the laws begin in a relatively predictable way for a Sumerian ruler, which is to give vast amounts of praise to the man himself. Ur-Nammu, the mighty warrior, the king of Ur, the king of Sumer and Akkad. You've probably heard it all before. But I won't lie, it's this kind of arrogance and egotism that draws me to ancient Middle Eastern history. I love their boundless self-confidence. But one of the really interesting things that Ur-Nammu does is standardizes weights and measures across his dominions. Presumably this is part of him establishing equity in the land. The weights and measures are very interesting. The weights themselves are shekels and mina, and the measurements are sela and gur. Ur-Nammu was credited with fashioning the bronze sela measure, which would have roughly just been a bowl that other bowls would have been based on. One sela was the capacity of about 1 litre, and 1 gur was a capacity of about 300 litres. And this is what barley seeds were poured into to measure. The weights were measured in shekels and minas, with 1 shekel being about 8.5 grams, roughly, and 1 mina, or mina, containing 60 shekels. The last part of the prologue deals with establishing the kind of justice the king is laying out. The orphan was not delivered up to the rich man. The widow was not delivered up to the mighty man. The man of 1 shekel was not delivered up to the man of 1 mina. It was about protecting the weak from the strong. I suppose that is, of course, the purpose of laws, but this was very much supposed to be about the king as a protector. So the laws begin in a fairly standard way. If a man commits murder, he's killed. If he commits a robbery, he's killed. If he kidnaps someone, he's to be imprisoned and pay 15 shekels of silver. It's all fairly standard stuff. The next laws deal with slavery, because slavery was completely normal. Then we arrive at laws that deal with women, and Most of the laws begin with "if a man," and that's because this is a law code written for a deeply patriarchal society. As you'd expect from a patriarchal society, the man is the head of the household, and legally it's spoken of as if he does own his wife. But it's important to remember that she's not his slave. He can't simply do as he wants to her. And as with most patriarchal societies, there is actually a great deal of protection for her, specifically against the depredations of other men. Another consequence of it being a patriarchal society is that the man bears almost all responsibility for anything that happens. But we can easily demonstrate that the woman is the property of a man. For example, if a prospective son-in-law enters the house of his prospective father-in-law, and the father-in-law gives his daughter to another man, the father-in-law shall return to the rejected son-in-law twofold the amount of bridal presents. And if a man violates the right of another man, and deflowers the virgin wife of a young man, they shall kill that male. That's how important the virginity of the wife was. And again, this wasn't done for the wife's benefit. At no other point is there a punishment for actually raping a woman who isn't a virgin. You can deflower a virgin slave woman by force, and you only have to pay 5 shekels of silver. If you rape a woman who's a widow or is just still the wife of another man, there's no punishment for it, at least not listed. But we don't have all of the laws, so maybe there were other laws that did punish that. But if we don't have them, then we can't comment on them. Women aren't really considered to be sovereign entities of their own, and I really don't think that any woman would have become an adult without getting married. And I think that the law that says if a man has slept with the widow without there being any marriage contract, he need not pay any silver. Because I think it's naturally assumed that she would be a widow or possibly divorced, but I very much doubt she will have been single, just by her own will, because of course her father would have given her away. But this is actually not as awful as it sounds. It sounds terrible to the modern ear, but that's because we're not in any danger of going hungry. We're not in any danger of banditry or any kind of invasion or anything like that. We live in the lap of luxury, and so we can be concerned with these things. For a woman living in Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago, not having a husband probably would have been quite a scary prospect. And in many ways these laws reflect that. If a man divorces his first-time wife, he shall pay her 1 mina of silver. That's not an inconsequential amount for her to purchase her own house or to purchase whatever she needs to be able to set up a business of her own. And if it's a former widow whom he divorces, he shall pay her 1/2 mina of silver, presumably because she would have inherited her husband's estate. Or if she had already been divorced, she would have already been given 1 mina of silver. Maybe I'm reading too much into these laws, but it seems that a widow would have had a reasonable amount of sexual freedom. Not having a husband and not being required by other men to be paid for having intimate relations, it doesn't really seem that she couldn't have other lovers if she wanted. There was probably a great deal of societal pressure on her not to, but legally, from what we've got, that doesn't seem to be the case. But I want to stress that I could be very wrong here. It's important to remember that women aren't considered to lack agency either. If the wife of a man followed after another man and he slept with her, they shall slay the woman, but that male shall be set free. It's written very much as if the man is only the person with any kind of agency, but the implication of the law is very much that the woman knew exactly what she was doing and she did it deliberately. And frankly, her sexuality belongs to her husband. And so she's effectively a thief. But the man who she sleeps with hasn't committed any wrong because, as implied, it's the woman's decision. She follows after him. And it's important to remember that false accusations were a real thing, and still are. If a man accused the wife of a man of adultery, then the river ordeal proved her innocent, then the man who had accused her must pay 1/3 of a mina of silver. Now is an interesting time to actually come to the value of things, because 1/3 of a mina is 20 shekels. That's a lot of money. I mean, if you kidnap someone, you're imprisoned and you have to pay 15 shekels of silver. If you cut off a man's foot, you only have to pay 10 shekels. So to falsely accuse a woman of adultery, A, is a big deal for the woman because she may well be killed, and B, you have to pay a very significant amount of silver. I find it interesting that if a man cuts off a man's foot, he has to pay 10 shekels, which isn't really that much. So I don't know how they're supposed to have got around. But if, in the course of a scuffle, smash the limb of another man with a club, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. Now, that's very interesting because it makes me think they probably didn't have any way of setting broken bones, because the value of that makes me think that that's rendering the limb useless. I mean, chopping off someone's foot, I would have thought, would render them unable to walk. I mean, maybe they created some kind of wooden prosthetic or something. But to pay a whole mina of silver simply breaking the limb of a man, then you would think that that means that the limb is rendered useless, or at least I would. And to sever the nose of a man with a copper knife, he must pay 2/3 of a mina of silver. That's a very specific law. I mean, maybe that happened quite a lot. And that's a lot to pay. So, you know, the disfigurement was considered quite important, I would assume. Because, I mean, if you knock the tooth out of a man's mouth, you only have to pay 2 shekels. I mean, what's that? I find the rest of the laws to be fairly mundane. If you cultivate the field of another man and you raise a complaint, then it's to be rejected and you'll lose anything that you've put into it because it's not your field. And if you flood the field of a man with water, then he gets compensation from you. It's all fairly standard stuff. So there's nothing really there to comment on, to be honest. But my favourite one, I think, is if a man's slave woman, comparing herself to her mistress, speaks insolently to her, her mouth shall be scoured with 1 quart of salt. That amuses me greatly. Now, my first thought is that this was the result of a few wives getting together and making this an issue. But then it occurred to me that maybe that's just me looking at it from a modern perspective. Maybe the master of the house would have been very much concerned with the dignity of his wife, the mistress of the house, and he quite probably wouldn't want her being disrespected by a slave girl. So maybe that was something that the men themselves would have been very concerned with. I really don't know. But I find it to be a very amusing law nonetheless. It's because the punishment's so, well, unusual for the Code of Laws. No one's being killed, no one's being imprisoned, no one's paying any money, she's just getting her mouth washed out. But with salt, no less. I mean, salt used to be very valuable, and it's not like it's reusable. It dissolves in water and saliva. So if you wash someone's mouth out with it, that's salt gone. But for some reason that was so important and presumably considered so unpleasant that I assume they weren't going to do it again. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting and informative, or as informative as I can make it, and thanks for listening.